different people have different ways of forming plurals for particular words, and that it's important to write those down. Those may be not just peculiar to the individual, but may be specific to a particular village or maybe a house or a tribe. I don't know, but they should not be overlooked. And one of the things we wouldn't want to do in the dictionary work and in the language planning, the language engineering type of work that needs to be done in the coming period is to overlook different ways of talking and to try to force the language into a single straitjacket. If that were done, it would leave many people out, and there simply would not be acceptance of the materials that are presented. I believe myself, and I think my experience bears me out on this, that it's necessary to recognize all the different ways of speaking. They're all equally good, although there are some differences between young people's speech and older people's speech, where people can agree that that the older ways perhaps are better. Also, I have to say that in the new work, we certainly would want to make use of the new technology, the new computer technology, not simply the hardware, the new computers that are available, but particularly the software. Those of you who don't know much about computers, hardware means, the actual machines, the physical material machines, whereas software is the instructions, the programs that you run on the machines. And there are several quite good programs now for doing language work, programs that people use in America and Canada, and as well programs we've developed and used in Australia for language work. And the new programs make it possible. There's no difficulty at all in doing a dictionary and putting in the different ways of pronouncing words, or if there are slightly different meanings for the same word that are current within a community, it can be done. They don't have to fit the language into a straitjacket. And I've been talking to you about national standard languages, and I've mentioned how national standard languages are always codified. They have grammars and dictionaries and so forth, and that they're taught formally. And if you look at national standard languages around the world, there are some real differences in them. And the reason why I'm going into this is that it is relevant to our work and to our undertakings. A language like French, or the country of France, has had very centralized political administration for some few hundred years now. And the French try to be very purist about their language, so that instead of just borrowing the word computer from English, they make up their own word. And there is actually a French academy which decides, what the new words of French are and what goes into French dictionaries and so forth, and more particularly what is taught in the schools. Similarly, in Germany, there is the equivalent of an academy, and decisions are made on, what words come into the language. English, on the other hand, the English-speaking countries have always resisted that sort of centralized language planning, and there's a lot of difference between the national Englishes that we talked about. But again, if you contrast that with French, the metropolitan French, when they hear Canadian French or Quebec French, always put it down, tend to make fun of it, where within the English-speaking countries we may laugh a bit when we hear the other person talking or find it a bit strange. but there's a different sort of attitude towards it. Well, for us, I think that if I have the sense of people, those of you whom I've talked to about it and whom I've listened to, that there's a fair bit of tolerance and understanding, that most of you understand dialects other than your own. People from the western villages understand the people from Max and Gitksan, and the people from over there understand the people here. But there's no desire to try to reach a single standard where you erase or ignore the local differences. And there's no reason to do that, because those differences are part of what makes the language so rich, because people have their own ways of expressing things. But I'd like to move on now. We looked then at the plurals and we saw there was a fair bit of difference, but I'd like to move on now further in grammar, and this morning to look at what are called parts of speech. And this is preliminary to moving into actual syntax, where we start learning how, well, not learning how, but analyzing how words are put together to form sentences. Notice I've been using terms like nouns and verbs, but I haven't defined to you what a noun is or what a verb is. But it is, of course, possible to do that. All languages have parts of speech. There is no human language that doesn't have parts of speech, and if you stop and think about it, you can't really have a language without having grammar, without having the different parts of speech. The parts of speech, by the way, are simply the different kinds of words, or different kinds of forms you find in languages. And when you look at languages around the world, there are certain parts of speech that you always find, that you'll find in any language. There is no language in the world that does not have, or no language in the world that lacks a part of speech that we could agree on, that we would want to call the noun part of speech. Similarly, there is no language of the world that lacks a part of speech called the verb. There is no language of the world that lacks the part of speech that we call the pronoun part of speech. But if you take a part of speech of the sort that in English we call the adjective part of speech, and I think that there is a similar part of speech, an adjective part of speech kind of word in Somalic, they will differ a bit across languages. In terms of their meaning, you'll see adjectives generally always signify qualities relevant to people and things, like colors and light and heavy, tall, short, skinny, fat, and so forth there. But in some languages, the adjectives are a separate part of speech. They're not like the nouns, they're not like verbs. In other languages, like most of the Australian languages I work with, the adjectives and the nouns are very much alike. And in Somalic, the adjectives and the verbs are very much alike. And I'll have to speak to you about how we define the differences between the two. Again, this morning, I'm introducing material to you. Don't worry if you come out at the end of it and you're not exactly clear about what a transitive verb is or what an adjective is and so forth, because we'll be using the terms again in the coming days. This is just an overview to set us up, because we need these terms when we start looking at full sentences. They will help us understand the structure of sentences, of how words are put together to form proper sentences. Now, I don't know whether you teach grammar in schools anymore. In Australia, by and large, they don't. In primary school or in secondary school, the kids come through 12 years of schooling and they don't know a noun from a verb, and in many cases they can't write very well, or if they do write well, it's because they've been to a school where they may have had some grammar, but they've certainly had spent lots of time on writing essays where they've learned to write English well by example. And by the way, writing is not something that comes naturally for most people. It's something you have to learn, and there are many people who are good speakers but not particularly good writers. One of the reasons for that is that the very channel, the medium of writing, putting things on paper, is a bit different than speaking. If we get a chance to go over some traditional stories, you'll see stories that are told primarily in the oral mode, passed by word of mouth, will have a lot of repetition in them. You can see a lot of patterning, that when you put it down on paper, it's as though they're repeating themselves too much when you take it in reading, because you can take in lots of information from the printed page. But when you hear it, it's quite different. It's not repetitive, and the very repetition helps you to remember, but it also, there's a form there that has a beauty and an elegance all of its own. But to come back to the parts of speech, if you have learned grammar in school, chances are you've been taught what is called traditional grammar. Traditional grammar, or sometimes it's called school grammar. And it's a little bit different from the sort of grammatical theory that linguists use, but it's a good preparation for thinking about linguistic ways, or about for moving into the kind of work that linguists do. And in traditional grammar, when you're taught the parts of speech, you're usually taught what are called notional definitions. By that I mean that you're taught, the parts of speech are such and such, and it's in terms of their meaning. So the old definition, a noun is the name, or a noun names a person, place, or thing. A noun names a person, place, or thing. There are difficulties with that, because there are nouns in English as well as other languages that don't name persons, places, and things, or it's the definition of, or the way we think of what a thing is, so broad that it just includes the whole world. But nevertheless, there's something about the notional definitions. They're not to be thrown out, but they need to be supplemented by another way of thinking, because it's true that nouns, for all languages, in most cases, are what we might call the prototypical, the usual meanings of nouns. Yes, they signify persons or people, places, or place names, and things, various sorts of phenomena, which can be material objects, or they can be events, like thunder and lightning, which are not really things, but they are events that take place in nature. So that while I've given you some sorts of notional definitions here, I've also moved to another way of looking at grammar that's different from traditional grammar or from school grammar. The sort of way of looking at language and that I've been talking to you about comes from what is called structural linguistics. Structural linguistics. Linguistics is simply the study of language, and structural linguistics is called that because it looks at the structure of language. We've been looking at the structure of words, stems and affixes, and compounds, how they are two independent words put together to form a new single word, so forth. And in structural linguistics, the notions of parts of speech are generally given structural definitions. That is, we define a noun not so much in terms of what it means or signifies, but we define a noun in terms of how does it behave in a sentence? What are the structural properties of nouns? What are the structural properties of nouns? For example, we've over the last week looked at that grammatical category of common noun, of common versus proper. And we've seen how the common nouns, forms that belong to the category of common noun, take a th connective before, and it doesn't matter whether they're singular or plural. And for the category of proper nouns like names and senior kinship terms, that there's no th connective, but sometimes there's an s connective, as in gas, Bruce. Next, Bruce saw his wife. And we can take that notion of proper versus common, and it applies only to one part of speech, basically the nouns, including pronouns, which are kind of noun, but it includes personal names and senior kinship terms. So that's what I mean by an example of a structural definition. I'm not going to try to formulate a structural definition of nouns specifically for you right now, but as we go along it'll become clear. Similarly, you can define a verb in terms of its structural properties. We'll see in sentences that the verb generally comes first in the sentence, and it has certain properties. It'll always have a root or a stem, and there'll be certain other things that co-occur with it. Well, to look then at the first page of this handout, and to begin to go through it, as I say at the top, these are if you don't have handouts, there's more up here, and there's also a second handout of the Lord's Prayer, which we'll go over during the second period. And I'd like to go through these. Again, yesterday, when we were looking at plurals, I indicated that the classification of different kind of plurals I did was basically a draft. It's provisional. I would do it a little bit differently now. Similar with these parts of speech, it might be that in the end we'd want to recognize a few more parts of speech, or that we want to put things like the adjectives together with the intransitive verbs. But nevertheless, I think that that minimally we need to recognize these different kinds of these different parts of speech, at least 12 different parts of speech. Well, to go down these, and these are listed in alphabetical order, That's the logic of the way they're listed. And by the way, all of these can be, for the most part, in giving examples or talking about it, I've given you notional definitions, but I'll talk about some of their structural properties. The class of adjectives includes words, or mainly includes words or forms that signify qualities relevant to people and things. People and things, and I've given an example in there of wheatis, get, or wheatis, lop, so forth, but wheatis, which means simply big or large, skutush, to be small, stin, to be heavy, or it can also have the meaning of important, machs, to be white, and you can break that down. It obviously consists of a stem, machs, which, white snow on the ground, so then machs describes the color of white, clean snow. For the most part, when you look at the adjectives in sentences, when you say of somebody, the rock is heavy, or the man is tall, or the house is white in color, the adjectives look like verbs. We'll see they fit into a sentence exactly the same way as a verb. But when you use them not as the main predicate of a sentence, we wanted to say something like a white house, then they're a bit different from verbs. But the word for house is wilp. How would we say a white house, a house that is white? Once more. Machshwa or machshwum? Okay. I'm not leaving myself quite enough here. Machshwum wilp. Does anybody, and you could write this either with XWIM or XUM, machshwum, machshwum. So, slightly different ways of pronouncing. Would any of you have it as machshwa, wilp? Do I see a nod? Okay. Okay, that's important to note in a dictionary that some adjectives, when they modify a noun, I'll just use this term, when they occur as an attributive, when they modify the noun, which always follows, like adjectives occur before a noun, just as in English. Sometimes the adjective forms its attributive with the im or the m suffix. Other times it will form an attributive with the a, and it's completely unpredictable so far as I can see. How about the adjective toots? Toots. To be black, and we can, toots occurs by itself, meaning charcoal, and there are numerous words that are formed with toots, so that something that's sooty is tootst, And the little black part of your eye is your tootsul, your pupil. But if I want to say a black man, a black person, would I say tootshum get or tootshwa get? Okay, again we'll get both. And it's important for adjectives to see. Now how about steen? We want to say a heavy rock. What do we say? Steenum loop? Is that okay? Pardon? No. If we say stink loop, we've got a whole sentence. The rock is heavy. But if we just want to say heavy rock and then use that in a sentence, like he picked up a heavy rock or something like that. Steenum, is that all right? Steenum loop? Okay, steenum loop. Would anybody say steena loop? Steena loop? I don't think so. I think that steen as an adjective always takes the M or the IM attributive suffix, whereas words like mach and toots will take either one and... Pardon? Okay, there's another way, machwit, as in machwit loop, machwit wilp, machwit wilp. I'll write this down. You're right, that is an adjective there, and it means White House. But if we look, if I understand it correctly, the difference between machwum wilp and machwit wilp is this means the house that is white. It's a particular house, or you just contrasted it with black houses or other kinds of houses. It's a definite adjective phrase. As, for example, we can talk about, I'll capitalize it, Sa'amat hike, where you see we have the same kind of construction with the IT and then the HL. This is the Holy Spirit, literally the good spirit, but we wouldn't just call the Holy Spirit, Amahike, good spirit, but this actually, by using this kind of construction, it picks out and identifies, specifically, the good spirit, the Holy Spirit is a translation. That's a bit more complicated, but I'm glad you brought it up because it's one way of using adjectives so as to be definite, more definite, or to be more precise in reference. Notice in English, with most nouns, we use words like the and a, the Holy Spirit, or a good spirit, or the White House, a White House. And you're generally taught in school grammar that the and a, one is definite, the other is indefinite. But if you, actually I think there's a better way of describing it in English, and I'll come back to it in a minute. If I say, did you see the man yesterday? Did you see the man yesterday? Just out of the blue to you. I'd say, good morning, did you see the man yesterday? It really sounds a bit strange because it assumes that, we've been talking about some man already. that we share information, that there is old information that we share, and I use the to refer to a definite man, whereas it would be most likely for me to say, good morning. Did you see a man yesterday? Where I use a. And what I'm talking about is the difference between what's called new information and old information. That in English, whether you use the or a is not just a matter of definite, but if it's new information being introduced for the first time, you use a, and after it's been used and the new information becomes old, you use the thereafter. There are no words like the and a in Somali, or that translate exactly as the and a. But there certainly are ways of indicating what's definite, what's indefinite, and what's new and what's old. One of the ways of making a noun phrase really definite and indicating old information is using this sli or shla prefix together with the it suffix to form a particular kind of relative clause. I'm getting a bit more complicated than I want it to be here.
Spinum low, say the heavy rock as well?
No, it would be, this stinum lo would be, in my understanding,
This
just,
rock.
well, or heavy rock, but how about stinit lo? If we've been looking at rocks and talking about it, and I tell you, and you know, there's big rocks, little rocks, light rocks, heavy rocks, and I tell you, you know, pick up the heavy rock. I think this is the way I would say it, because it picks out, you know, a single definite rock. How about this? Tlestinit lob.
Used to be heavy.
Okay, or how about just stinit lob? Stinit lob. Okay. Okay, stinit lob. But at any rate, you see, we're using this right here. That's what changes it. This it gives you a different kind of meaning than does the or the im. The we'll get onto with some examples, more examples later on. But there are lots of adjectives in the language, and here's another thing. How do you test whether a word is a verb, an intransitive verb, or an adjective? To my knowledge, for most verbs, you can put them inside of a sentence that begins with you. So if you have a verb like bach, to run, you can say yuk bahat, or yuk bachat. He's running. But can you say yuk mausht? What's that mean? Okay, that. Then if that bears out what I'm saying. See, we can take a verb like bach, and follow yuk, so that we get yuk bahat, and where the T right here means he or it or she, yuk bahat. We can say yuk mahush, where there's no nothing on it. And what would that mean, Margaret? Yuk mahush.
When you're turning gray, maybe. You come out the moisten. Yeah, you can use it.
Okay, my hair's turning white there. But how about yuk mahush with a T on it? Does it sound a bit strange? or you stint. Okay, the reason, okay, well that's why I'm saying it. I'm not trying to be funny. What I'm saying is, if you can put the T on and have yuk before it, you've got a verb. If you put it after and put the T on and it sounds funny, then you've got an adjective. You see, the adjectives have different structural properties than the verbs. They not only mean that they signify qualities, whereas verbs typically, prototypically signify activities or events, but the way they're used in sentences is a bit different. And when I make up things like you stint, it sounds funny because you see I'm using an adjective as though it were an intransitive verb, even though in most other cases it behaves like an intransitive verb. On the other hand, sometimes you can take verbs and make them act, or they'll look like adjectives, so that this bach, I know of a name from Kispiox, which is Baham or Baam-got, where you see you take Bach and you put the AM attributive after it. And it's sort of like what, beating heart or racing heart? Something like that, racing heart. Okay, adjectives. I'm just trying to introduce you to them now. Haven't given a good definition of them. May not give one, but I hope by this time next week that we all understand what they are, and that they are a separate class of speech. And in doing a dictionary for the adjectives, you need to indicate, whether they take the vowel M ending or the ah ending, or maybe both of them. There's another another part of speech I want to move on to now, the second one, adverbs. And if in English, if you remember your school grammar, and you're generally taught adverbs modify verbs, adjectives, and other adverbs, that sort of thing. Generally, adverbs would include things like quickly, the boy ran quickly, where the quickly modifies run, or the house is very dirty, where very is said to be an adverb and it modifies dirty. It's an adverb modifying an adjective. And then other cases where adverbs modify adverbs. In Somalia, there's a class of a part of speech that we want to call adverbs, but they don't modify verbs strictly or nouns. What I'm getting at is that their structural properties are quite different from those of English adverbs, and their meanings are different from English adverbs, but nevertheless, adverb is a good term for them. For the most part, adjectives in Somalia signify time or periods of time and place. So that a word like hitu, we would recognize as being hitu, which means morning. We'd recognize as being an adverb. Forms like daus, a little while ago, gegenig, do, over there. These all signify time or place. They, as I say, they're different from adverbs in English. But and in Somalic they are probably most closely related to nouns. You can say things like, as we say to each other every morning, you can take the adjective and put it before and say to somebody, good morning. Do we say im hisuch? Does take im or ah? Suffix, it takes the ah. Im would be pigeon Somalic, but hisuch, good morning. So it looks like a noun there, and has many of the properties of a noun. But in English, we can say things like, the day wore me down. When I look at sentences in Somalic that have the word hisuch in them, generally hisuch, you wouldn't have it being used as something that can do something to people. It doesn't. Most nouns can act, or many nouns act as agents, can act on other entities. But for the most part, hisuch, we'll see, simply signifies a time, or a period of time, namely the morning. Similarly, forms like beginning, the upstream area, and do over there will signify, a place or an area. And they don't occur as subjects or objects of sentences, but they tell you where something takes place, where something is located, or when it is located. And the reason why we call them adverbs, essentially, is that they do modify, or they tell us where and or when some activity or event that's signified by the verb or the predicate takes place. Okay, there's a third kind of part of speech that is called an ambient predicate. An ambient predicate, that's a terrible big long phrase. I can't think of any simpler English for it. It's not a term that I invented myself, but it's a term that Marie-Lucie Tarpon, who is the linguist who worked with the Niskat people for a number of years in their bilingual program. But ambient, to give you an idea of its meaning, the ambient predicate. Ambient, essentially, you can think of as meaning outside. The ambient temperature, well, it's not simply the outside temperature. The ambient temperature is the temperature that goes up and down, whether you're in a room or whether you're outside. Ambient, I think, actually means moving or changing, but it's used in describing weather or meteorology so perhaps we might want to call these weather predicates rather than ambient predicates, might be a better way of describing them. They're called predicates. A predicate is something that predicates, that tells you about something else. So that verbs are predicates, adjectives are predicates, but these are predicates that tell you about the weather. And in Somalic, these sorts of words like goyim, mesach, wis, madam, they mainly signify the weather and seasons of the year. That is, not simply a small one day's weather, but the weather over a particular season, like Sint, and so forth. And things like goyim and mesach, they can occur themselves, just single words, and be a whole sentence. You just say wis or massage. They can occur by themselves as whole sentences, or you can use them with sawis, massage. You know, it's now daylight. Unlike in English, we can't just say rain, but we have to say it's raining, or it's raining now, or it's snowing now, or it's fall now, it's autumn, it's winter. Whereas in Somalia, you can use these ambient predicates or weather words, maybe that's a better way to call them, weather words. You can use them completely independently on their own. And again, I haven't heard sentences such that would translate into English like, you know, the cold winter really wore me down, you know, as though the winter were a thing or an agent that, you know, has an action on me there. And actually what I'm skirting at right now are ways of looking at the world, ways of conceiving the world, that matters of world view. And the way I was trained in anthropology, sort of anthropology I do, if you want to learn about the way other people see the world, or about other worldviews, about other cultures, the best way to do it is through the language and the way people talk to one another. Okay, so then the ambient predicates. After the ambient predicates, there's a fairly small class, a fairly small part of speech class, which we'll call demonstrative pronouns. Demonstrative pronouns. These are in English words like this, that, here, there, so forth. Now and then are actually demonstrative too. But in Somalia, the demonstrative pronouns include things like tun, tus, dipun, dipust. They pick out some particular person or group of people, some particular thing or things, and they specify whether that person or thing is near to the speaker or somewhat removed from the speaker. So, tun, tus, tun, tus, this, that. Notice that this is always closer to whoever is speaking than that is. And then there are some languages, for example, instead of having words that mean this and that, just to give you a bit of comparative information, a word like, a language like Japanese. Japanese has, if I can remember right, the word for book in Japanese is hon, so that this book, kono hon, it actually means this book near me, whereas sonohon means the book near you. You can translate it as that, but it actually is best translated as, you know, the book near you, not me. And anohon means the book not near me, not near you, but near him or her, near somebody else there. But in Somalia, we have simply tun and tust, this and that. I've translated as near or removed from the speaker, but some of you might think about it, and maybe that tust means really not near me, but near you. You know, it's something to think about. I haven't actually worked on it. Now, of course, there are other ways of tun and tust, dipun and dipust, don't always have quite that same form. If I tell somebody, you know, eat this, I don't say goop-tun, but goopsun, or goosun, pick this up, rather than goose or goose-tun, but goosun. But just a fairly small set of demonstrative pronouns. Then there is a class of verbs that are called intransitive verbs, and I'll abbreviate that as VI. And notice with these that I've given abbreviations for the different parts of speech. When you pick up an English dictionary and you look up the word man or some word that's a noun, it doesn't actually spell out noun, but it'll typically just have N with a dot or N after it. So it's useful for a dictionary to have abbreviations for parts of speech type. But intransitive verbs are verbs that prototypically, or in the usual case, signify states and actions that are not done to a particular place or thing. So some examples of intransitive verbs would be like to sit, to be sitting, or for an object that is longer than it is tall, it rather than het. Limp, to sing, is an intransitive verb. Gees, edda, gees, and go to bed. That's an intransitive verb. Yoke, to eat, is intransitive. Gebäs, to wait, is intransitive. But the thing about intransitive verbs right now is that they signify actions or states that are not done to somebody or to something. I'm going to come back to them later. I'm not going to tell you about their structural properties now. I'll do that when we get over on the second and third pages. Okay. Next, there's a class of words that we call modifiers. There's no similar part of speech in English, although there are ways of saying the same sorts of things, but these tend to be little short words like d, and sach, and ha or ho, so forth. Up as in up, semen. They tell how the action or state that is signified is considered, how the speaker views it, or what the speaker's attitude is, or how the action is performed. And these, by the way, are probably the hardest words to teach to language learners. You can often say, well, look, you put D in a particular place in the sentence, but to tell somebody when you use, how you, when it is you use D, or when it is you use up, or keh, or sech, that's very difficult to do, and in fact can't be done without telling people a lot about the culture and about social action, social interaction. Just to take that a bit farther, to be a bit technical, in my view, you can't do linguistics fully without being an anthropologist. You can't describe a language fully in all of its richness without also having learned or studied the culture at the same time. Then there's next a very, very large number, a very large class of words that belong to the noun part of speech. And prototypically, or that is, the sort of most exemplary noun, or the noun par excellence, to use a French, that kind of noun is the noun that signifies persons, animals, physical objects, places, not gililic or gigienic type places, but places like Gitksan, named places, and qualities considered in themselves. So a word like hanak, woman, axe, in the sense of water or stream, but not to drink, uget, hasak, and we or we o, those are nouns. And right now, I won't say much further, but quite often in English, we say things like, I want something, or I love somebody, I like somebody. And those English I want or you want will get translated into Somalia with the word hasak, like hasakae, hasagan, hasak. Or I love something, we ui, or we oi, depending on how one pronounces it there. I'll just say to you now that when we look at the grammar, if we look at the structural properties of words like hasak and we oh, I think I can show you that they really are not verbs. They're verbs in English, but in our Somali they are nouns. So that a literal translation of something like hasaga ma'i, I want berries, is probably a more literal translation would be my desire or my want is berries. And I'll show you later how we can test that. Right now, just take my word for it. Don't argue with me. But I wouldn't say it if I wasn't reasonably sure. After that are the numerals. Numerals, which include numbers like kul, kek, kiki, gilbil, pchat, gwilan, chalch, and so forth. They signify number in the, is it cardinal numbers, the cardinal numbers like 1, 2, 3, 4. There are also ways of signifying ordinal numbers like skolk, the first, and two gilbil or two gilbilin something or other, like the second, third, and so on there. The numbers, while we'll recognize them as a separate part of speech, and remember there's at least three number sets, depending on whether you're counting humans, animals, or inanimate objects. In the old days, there's a special set of numerals for canoes. And in Reverend Price's little primer, in the numbers there, he has the old words for counting canoes, if I remember correctly. And the Niska still use those. And there are also special ways of counting, bundles of hides and so forth. But we'll consider the numbers, the numerals, to be a part of speech all their own, although they are a bit like nouns, and again, sometimes a bit like intransitive verbs. Then next, a class of part of speech which I'll call pre-nominals. Pre-nominals, I won't say what their meaning, try to give a definition of their meanings, but they're used to build up complex nouns, or another word for noun, and many linguists will use noun for simple forms like, man, woman, but nominal would be, a larger, more complex noun or noun phrase, something like, the old man or the young woman. So just take nominal as being another word for noun, but, or a nominal is a complex noun. Well, these pre-nominals, or you might think of them as pre-nouns, examples, they're used to build up complex nouns or nominals. And they would include forms like lach, as in lach skatnist. In the mountains, it's literally on the mountains, but the translation into English should be as in, lach skatnist, or see, and it always will be followed. You don't just say lach by itself. but lach will always have a noun following it. Yeah, we'll always have a noun following it then. Sim is another pre-nominal. I think that I would want to consider words like sku, as in skutish, as being a pre-nominal, or the plural of sku is what? One child is skutish, what's the plural? Kuba. Kuba-kish. 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 Okay, what's the relationship, just a bit of review right now. Sku and kuba, are they related by compounding, by affixation, or by vowel change? How are singular and plural, how are they related, sku and kuba? Remember our word suppletion? Sku is to kuba as kek is to hoot. In other words, singular is to plural as, something that sounds this way as opposed to something that sounds completely different. That's just a bit of review. But I think words like sku and kuba are pre-nominals. How about we, to be big, as in we taste, we get the culture hero, giant, or can mean a big man.
That's big head chief is a good one.
We get. And spell it like this then. If we write it, it's two words, but remember, it's not like English we, or Scottish we, meaning small, which has a different meaning, but notice this is with soft. But if we just say we get, it doesn't sound right. It has to be the hard W. We get. Okay, what's the plural of we? We want to say big men. Wita. Wita. Egu. Wita. Egu. So we and wita don't sound very much alike. Again, I would say suppletion. Some of you have a long vowel there? And do you have it as hard? Wita. Okay, with a hard W and a long I. Wita. Okay. Okay, like that. But I know that this particular pronunciation, wita, is also used. But singular and plural. But the point is that these would be examples of pre-nominals. And let's take our break. It's about 20 past our work together. So we've just looked at the pre-nominals that are used to build complex nouns or nominals. And there's not really a great many of words like lach, sim, sku, we, and so forth. I'd hesitate to say, but probably no more than 20 or so. Whereas the next part of speech, what I call pre-verbals, there are quite a few of the pre-verbals, probably something like 200 or so of them. And just as the pre-nominals are used to build up complex nouns or nominals, the pre-verbals are used to build up complex verbs, or what I prefer to call verb themes. Verb themes. A verb theme is a complex verb. It'll have a root and several pre-verbals with it. And, you know, they're often very difficult to translate fully into English. But the examples of, some examples of the pre-verbals are, and I believe that these are separate words, these pre-verbals, and also, before giving examples, the pre-verbals are what in Boaz, in the Boaz grammar, are called proclitics. Proclitics, the things that occur before a verb. I think that they are separate words, but yet you don't say words like lu and ni and balgi by themselves. You generally use them always with a verb stem to make up a complex theme. And you can have complex pre-verbals, things like lu bagait, lu bite, something other. When you lu bite will, it means you do something to no good end, or, you know, just mucking around, or so forth. But, and there's a difference between lu bagait and, say, dula, which you know, you can lu bagait al yach and you can dula al yach, which somewhat similar meanings, but nevertheless different. And these pre-verbals, for the most part, correspond to English prepositions like in, on, through the middle, at the tip, clip, or you know, in the middle of a long round thing, like I could think of a nickname of a person his nickname was Silok. Silok, as you know, means rotten. Well, the C there, actually it should be, there's a space in between there. C means, you know, in the middle of a long round thing, like a cylinder. Silok. Lutek. Words like that are very, very descriptive. And these pre-verbals, often their meanings are pretty specialized. They're pretty specialized, and you need to use them in a dictionary. In a dictionary, you need to give examples of them. But there might be a few you'd want to leave out. Or we, in the old days, they would translate these into Latin. Maybe we just leave them in Somalia.
Well, that's what the churches try to do. They found out that they couldn't.
Yeah.
So Thomason tried to change their language.
Yeah. Well, that raises a good point. There's many people have told me you can't cuss or you can't curse, can't swear in Somalia, because in English, you know, that lots of words you have two ways, a polite way and a swearing way of using it, whereas by and large in Somalia you use the same word, and it doesn't have those obscene connotations. I'd have to say, by the way, that those swear words in English, what we call four-letter words in English, have not always been swear words or obscene words. And there's nothing, you know, there's nothing inherent in the English language that makes the so-called four-letter words obscene. And in fact, they were used publicly. Shakespeare often used them in his plays before they got edited out. But it was only with the development of Puritanism and, you know, the religious movements of the 17th and 18th century in Britain that those words became obscene and weren't used publicly anymore. Okay, so the pre-verbals. The next class of next part of speech I want to talk about just briefly are the pronouns. And examples of pronouns in English are things like I, you, he, she, we, us, they, them, and so forth. In some algef that would be forms like ni, nin, nisim, nidit, na, as in Nathwesh, Dagan, you know, what's the name of you? No, that'd be Gwitwesh, Dagan, excuse me. If you ask somebody, what's your name? What, Nathwesh? Nathwen, excuse me, Nathwen. Na is an indefinite pronoun, but what the pronouns do basically, if you think about the meaning of words like I in English or ni in Algic, they tell you that the speaker is the, you know, a participant in a speech event, something is being said, is also a person who did something that's being talked about. So when I say, I'm talking to you right now, the I tells you that the I, you know, it's the speaker, and that I means Bruce Rigsby when I'm speaking, but I means Richard Daly when Richard is speaking. You is Richard when I'm talking to you, but you is me when you're talking to me. But the thing of it is that the pronouns, as it were, are words of language that reach out into the speech event of speaker and hearer and label the social roles of, take the social roles of speaker, hearer, and audience, and tell how those relate to whatever it is you're talking about, or who you're talking to there. I won't give the full pronoun paradigms this morning because there's not time right now, but we will have to do that tomorrow or very soon. A pronoun paradigm. A paradigm is a family of related forms, so that nit would be part of the absolutive pronoun paradigm in Sabaga. Lastly, before we move on to other things, the last part of speech on here are the transitive verbs. Transitive verbs. And transitive verbs, as verbs, they typically or prototypically signify actions or events and processes. But transitive verbs, unlike intransitive verbs, signify actions that are done to, performed on a particular person or people or thing or things. So that goop is a transitive verb, as in gubi or gubin, hanash, you ate the bread. Gibah, well, goop is a transitive verb as opposed to york or talk. I'll tomorrow give more examples and show how those, they're both verbs, but they, the way you use them in sentences is quite different, but they both mean eat. But whereas when you york, it describes the action of eating, but without saying what it is you eat or that you're eating, whereas when you goop, you're always eating some particular thing. Gibah, to wait. Similarly, you have to always say who it is, generally who it is that you're waiting for. Whereas with gibes, that also means waiting, but you don't have to say. And even if you do say who you're waiting for or on, it's not quite focused. The action is not quite the same as in gibah. Words like ots, as in ots de tin can or whatever. Ots is a transitive verb. Is in the sense of to hit or bash, that's a transitive verb. Does anybody have any questions about parts of speech right now. Because I doubt that you would have, covered this sort of material before, but it is very important. As I say, all languages have parts of speech. All languages have nouns and verbs. They may or may not have a separate class of adjectives, but they'll have some kind of words that function like adjectives. All languages have personal pronouns with words like I and you, but not all languages have words for he, she, it, they, so forth. Some languages handle those notions differently. And this, I think, is a classification that will pretty well handle the different parts of speech. It doesn't leave anything out. But, and again, quite often non-native people, so-called mainstream people, often have unquestioned prejudices or stereotypes about indigenous languages. That you can still pick up books in Australia that will tell you, that there was just one Aboriginal language and it had only a few hundred words and that they had to supplement it with hand signs. There's one famous passage I sometimes use from a U.S. Army officer in the last century who said that the Apaches had their language, had only a few hundred words, and they had to supplement it with hand signs so that they couldn't see in the dark unless they were around a fire. Well, I suspect the Apaches probably taught him a thing or two, if not about the language, about invading their land. But there is really no such thing as a primitive language or a language without grammar.
Well, you could say that with Frenchmen too, couldn't you, too?
Well, people differ, different languages and cultures, yes, in terms of how much they use the hands, and the French do use their hand a lot more than Anglo-Saxons do. Or I shouldn't say Anglo-Saxons, English-speaking people. But again, there's differences between British and American. Well, Mel yesterday was asking about Pig Latin, and that got me to thinking about what I'll call speech play and verbal art. And in English we have proverbs we use. Nothing ventured, nothing lost. A penny a day. An apple a day keeps the doctor away. What's the one about save a penny, gain a pound, or something like that? Yeah, penny saved is a penny earned. Sayings that are conventionalized in the language which we use at appropriate times. But what I'd like to ask you to think, I'll give you an example of a proverb that I learned over on the NAS some years ago, and to see if you can think of any proverbs. This one, I'll write it in this pack. Write it in Niska, so it's pronounced differently from our way, but the alphabet is the same, so that if we just sound it out, we'll get the Niska pronunciation right, and its meaning should come to you. But Gwilks Oos, Quilks qaos, goose. Qaos or goose. Soos or what's the other word for fetch?
School?
Can't think of it right now, but quilks qaos, khamsim, we say khamsim. Khamsim is who? We get sometimes the anthropologists will translate the name as Raven, with a capital R there, because he often took the form of a raven. And then Guisqacht, Quilksqaos Khamsim Guisqacht, which means something like Khamsim or Khamsim, we get went back and got, went back and fetched, or returned to fetch. What's his Guisqacht? Okay, now what kind of blanket? It's guis, tells us it's a blanket, but his raven blanket, the raven cloak, which, made him look like a raven. Now, I don't know whether you have the same story over here. I think I've heard it over here, but, there are lots of stories about Uygat or Khamsim, and one time he passed through the village of the air people, the people of the air, and he went into a house that was apparently empty. He couldn't see anybody there, and he spotted a guis halait, a shaman's, a medicine man's cloak or blanket. And so he took his guisqacht off, tore it into pieces, and put on that guis halait. And as he was about to walk out with that guis halait on, there was an invisible arm which reached out from behind and grabbed it off of him, so that he had to Quilksqaos Khamsim Guisqacht. He had to go back and to get his old raven blanket, sew the little pieces together before he continued, going on up Xilisimst, the Nass River, or we would call it Xikemsum. The old people here called it Kemsum's River rather than Lisim's, which is their own way of speaking it. But this is a proverb which people over at Gitksan will use. Say, for example, if somebody buys a new outboard motor and is using it, and it breaks down, and they have to get out their old outboard motor and use it. Somebody might say to that person, just to remind them, Quilksqaos Khamsim Guisqacht. Khamsim had to go back and get his old raven blanket. It's a proverb then. Now, if you can remember any of those, these would be very good to use in teaching material because they teach a lesson. It's very rich cultural heritage. In order to understand it, you have to know about Uygat or Khamsim to understand it, and it has a moral to it as well.
I use one with my class when we get goal setting, like what Fred Johnson says.
Yeah.
And again. You go as far as you could see, and when you get there, you could always see more.
Good. I won't try to write that down just now, but if we could write that down later, it would be good. But think about think about proverbs and see if you can come up with some. Another class of not quite proverbs, but but what I might call notable sayings, things that get ways of phrasing or that people repeat over, use them time after time because they're very expressive, and well, you can translate them into English, but the way they sound in Somali is very funny. And over the years I've written some of these down. Let's see, this is in Eastern Gitksan. Let me write it down and then we'll read it.
Yeah.
This is in Eastern Gitksan, and I've heard this expression used of several people. So rather than use their names, I put kina, which just means, so-and-so. But we can say of certain people, Hatsum legi Wilsons kina kangan, kaskos shetwilach yel. So-and-so can make trees walk. The way they know how to tell lies. So you see, it's a very colorful expression. Hatsum legi Wilsons kinash kangan kaskos wilach yel. Notable sayings. Again, try to think of some of these. If anybody has any, be sure to try to write it down or to write it down. Here's another one I'll put on the board, and another notable saying. This again is in Eastern Gitksan. And it's a quite descriptive phrase. Go over it slowly. Sim, hogehuish, siwas toots, quasi wildit, eali pikdit. And it describes the difference between indigenous people, Gitksan people, who know where they come from and where they belong, and are always here, from what in Australia we call blow-ins. Blow-ins. White people are really like birds. Sometimes they are newly arrived or newly come, and then they fly away. Sim hoge chwech am siwad toots, gosi wilde di ali paikdid. Some of you may have Lee paikdid there too, with a long So, notable sayings, and like I was saying with the Proverbs, these are things that should be written down now, and I think can go into your teaching materials. So it's not just the language that we're concerned to strengthen and teach, but it's the culture. And in these sayings and these proverbs, the culture is really rich, extremely rich. Anybody have any questions or comments? But again, you see, it's, to try to translate, you can translate these into English, these notable sayings, and, the meanings come through, but they don't sound quite the same. They're very sound, just the way, it's sort of like poetry, the way it sounds in Somalia.
I think I remember one that's really important to me, that I hear, that sounds pretty good in English too when I put it there, but when I put it in Gitksan, it sounds different.
Yeah.
I used to listen to old Fred Johnson a lot. He says, if you have a problem, that problem carries its own seeds of solution. Så där låg ett hit med läraren med hjärnan, så jag lärde nog en av dem på läraren. Men you do it, it still sounds pretty good to me. If you have a problem, look at it. It carries its own seeds of solution.
Good. Okay, well, it's important, as I say, to, or at least I believe and suggest to people, it's important to write these down and to consider, using them in curriculum materials. There are other, we did just at the very beginning some tongue twisters, and there may be more tongue twisters. I haven't heard them. But another kind of way that people use the language for fun, probably also to teach, too, are what the old people called yak. Well, how will we translate yak into English? Riddles, what are called riddles. Now, so to say unfortunately, the riddles that I have are, well, we'll see how they go in mixed company. I'll write these down and then we'll say them. When you ask somebody, it did the yak. Well, this one actually is quite okay. It did the call out my riddle. Zaach de gup sha'an. Zachte goop zaanks. If we want to translate it in English, when something is anks, what's that mean? It's cooked, so anks would be something after it's cooked. And we know goop by itself is to eat, but something which is goop is something which is eaten or is edible. So zachte goop zaanks. It's something you can't eat after it's cooked. The answer to this in Eastern Gitksan what is your ta? Your eye. Your eye. And what's so clever about this is anks normally means what to be cooked, but has another meaning too.
Burn, your eyes distorts.
A cataract.
Yeah.
If you have a cataract where it's clouded over. So it means not just, it has two meanings. In other words, this is a pun. It's based on a pun, where sa'ank can mean either something after it's cooked or something after it's cataracted over.
Instead of riddle, I like to call it when I'm doing it, trivial pursuit.
Trivial Pursuit,
Would you work
1992 version. Yeah. But this is a pun then, and again, puns, if you can think of them, are very good ways of teaching language because they appeal to or they make use of knowledge of the different meanings of words, so that in a dictionary, when we put unks into the dictionary, it'll have its main meaning, the meaning, in everyday will be to be cooked, but it will have to have a second sense that refers specifically to whatever your pronunciation, and meaning to be cataracted over or to have a cataract. It might be that it's called that because sometimes cataracts, you can see them, it's sort of white, like when an egg white, how after it's cooked it takes on color from having been clear. Okay. Another one. This I'm writing it the way the person who told it to me pronounced it. Gitksan I utgu or I lutgu. I utgu lach se dasht. I och se bachvaakslaat.
Where are you?
Oh, it's a very, very harmless Gitksan. Okay, you know what sock is? You know the bird? Sock. The robin redbreast, the robin. And perhaps it's called that because, you know, it has the breast that's oval shaped. Gitksan. And it has hair around its periphery, to use a big English word there, around its circumference. Equal, and sometimes water runs out of it. Same thing.
Oh, I again?
Yeah, I again.
So I thought it was something.
Okay. Now just one more, but let's see if you can,
So he said like listen. So that's why I asked him for something that could listen with water running out of the whispers around. Yeah. It's not slippery, but so calm. So let us go.
if I've got it right, let's sound it out. I'll begin with it, zidiyaki, we knocked, we knocked, we lies, zit hem geest, als am uit. equals 6 cat. 8 kanevela gigit. Legit will no. Will will cat. It's a bit teeny there. Very simple answer. Very simple answer. It has a 4-letter answer. Has a 4-letter answer. Yeah. Lent. Snake. Now, a couple of these are also, this one, I think this one and the one just before, there are English versions, so it's probably, people, borrowed from English or translated from English. But the main point is that there is an indigenous tradition, a native tradition of riddling that was here long before the white fellas came. And if you can remember riddles that your grandparents taught you or old people taught you, it would be good to write them down and again to use them with kids. Or as well, there's no reason why you can't make up new riddles. Well, when I was a kid with my sister and my brother, we would sometimes spend a couple of hours, say on a rainy day, playing what we call Riddle, Riddle Marie. I see something you can't see, and it is, what's its name? And, try to fool one another. But you do it by using the language to describe the object in an ambiguous way, where you're hiding the meaning by describing it in an ambiguous way, a way that can be interpreted more than one way. And it's then up to the person listening to you to try to figure out, what the correct answer is.
We use it in our classes. The simple guy at Gilbert over there.
Good.
Same as the white person I described with my 2 little eyes.
Good. Good. They
We use it Fridays. We have little games on Fridays, songs, games.
great.
And we do that. Yeah.
Good. But you see, you're not only teaching language there, using language, but you're also teaching, some skills of reasoning and logic and interpretation. Okay, well, those, I thought it would be useful to go over this, because essentially what we're talking about is the indigenous traditions, the parts of your culture that focus on language, whether riddles or proverbs or these notable sayings. Anybody have any questions or comments?
But not a few of these younger ones don't know what it is.
This? Okay, yeah. If you want. The writing is not the same as the writing I've used here.
It's good when you have a little get together, like a little talking group. Talking or something.
Okay,
We
well,
don't have TV, that's why we used to do it.
again, that word sock, or sock, to be oval shaped is the meaning I know, is a word that not a lot of people know. That, yeah. Pardon? Yeah. I How do you say it? Okay, well, new word. Have I got it? Have I got it right? So. Okay. So. Okay, well, this part right here is the round or oval shape.
Is that not a word for whistle as well? So,
Could be. All the word I know is ha-squeak for whistle.
you so when you're singing or whistling a song? No?
Well, no, I think we better write that down.
No, there is that wind. There's also a song. And yelp, which is when you just move your lips and you don't make any noise.
Okay. Well, it looks like I set the cat amongst the pigeons by using that word salt, which is a word that people know with different meanings, and again, just by itself, I don't think it's actually the robin, Gitksan, but it's the smaller native bluebird, which looks like a robin but has, that small, bright, small oval-shaped breast. And it may not come everywhere. That may be why people don't recognize it. Yeah.
There's a person named Black Soap. So this could some negative.
Turn to something a bit more serious. Friday a week ago, no, it was not. It was Friday, almost 2 weeks ago, when we met in Hazleton. People came up there, and we reviewed some of the stuff some of the work we had done earlier in the week on writing, but to try to consolidate and build on what we had done before, we had a go at translating the Lord's Prayer. At the time I asked people to do that, I was thinking that perhaps there was a conventional way of translating or saying the Lord's Prayer in Somalia. I know that there is one that the Niska people use. It's been written down for 60, 70 years. And so that I thought it would be just an easy task. All I wanted was something that everybody would know how to say, and then we would simply write it down, and you could get an example of the writing system and read it back. As it turns out, people had different ideas on how it should be translated, and there was no single agreement. So there is an Eastern Gitksan version here with slightly different, one of the lines is slightly different. And then Art brought in a copy of the Lord's Prayer from his father, and yesterday we worked on it and put it into the new alphabet.